September 8, 1380. Dawn breaks slowly over a fog-drenched field where two rivers carve through the Russian wilderness. The air is cold, heavy, and unnaturally still, as if the land itself is holding its breath. Somewhere in that mist, tens of thousands of men stand waiting. Horses shift restlessly. Armor creaks. No one speaks. Because everyone knows what's coming next will decide far more than who lives or dies today. For over a century, the Mongol Empire has ruled these lands with absolute dominance. Cities have burned, leaders have bowed, and entire generations have grown up believing one thing: the Mongols cannot be defeated. Their cavalry moves faster, strikes harder, and thinks smarter than any army that has ever faced them. They don't just win battles, they erase resistance. But today feels different. On this field, an outnumbered force has made a choice that borders on reckless. There will be no retreat, no second chance. Behind them lies a river they deliberately crossed, cutting off their own escape. Ahead of them stands the most feared war machine on Earth. And somewhere, hidden just beyond sight, buried in silence and patience, waits something the Mongols have never encountered before. Not a new weapon, not a larger army, but a single idea, a calculated risk, a secret that, if unleashed at the perfect moment, could shatter the myth of Mongol invincibility forever. This is the story of the day everything changed. To understand why the events at Kulikovo mattered, you have to step back more than a century, back to a time when the Mongols didn't just arrive as invaders, but as a force that rewrote the rules of war. In 1237, under the command of Batı Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, Mongol armies poured into the fractured lands of the Rus principalities. What followed wasn't a conventional campaign. It was systematic destruction. City after city fell in rapid succession: Ryazan, Vladimir, Suzdal, each one overwhelmed in days, sometimes hours. Walls that had stood for generations proved meaningless. Resistance wasn't just defeated, it was erased. By 1240, the conquest was complete. But the Mongols didn't need to occupy every inch of territory to control it. Instead, they built a system that was, in many ways, even more effective. Local princes were allowed to rule, but only under Mongol authority. They paid tribute, silver, furs, even people, and in return, they were granted the right to govern. It was a system designed not just to dominate, but to divide. As long as the Rus remained fragmented, competing for Mongol favor, there would be no unified resistance. And for over 100 years, it worked flawlessly. At the heart of that dominance was the Mongol Cavalry, the most advanced and feared military force of its time. These weren't heavily armored knights bound by rigid traditions. They were highly mobile, highly disciplined warriors who could cover extraordinary distances at speeds their enemies couldn't match. Each rider often traveled with multiple horses, allowing them to rotate mounts and maintain momentum over long campaigns. While European armies exhausted themselves marching, Mongol forces seemed to appear out of nowhere, striking with precision and vanishing just as quickly. Their weapons were just as effective. The composite bow, compact yet incredibly powerful, allowed Mongol archers to fire accurately even at full gallop. They could unleash a deadly storm of arrows from a distance, weakening enemy formations before ever committing to close combat. And when they did engage, it wasn't chaotic, it was coordinated. Units moved like parts of a single machine, executing complex maneuvers with almost perfect timing. But what truly set them apart wasn't just their speed or skill. It was how they thought about war. The Mongols mastered psychological warfare long before it had a name. They spread fear intentionally, through reputation, through stories of total annihilation, through the calculated use of terror. Entire cities would surrender without a fight simply because they had heard what happened to those who resisted. And on the battlefield, they used deception as a weapon. Feigned retreats would lure enemies out of position, only for hidden forces to strike from the flanks. By the time their opponents realized they'd been tricked, it was already too late. For generations, this combination of mobility, discipline, and psychological dominance made the Mongols seem unstoppable. They didn't just defeat armies, they broke the will of entire nations. To face them was to confront not just a superior military force, but the deeply ingrained belief that resistance itself was futile. And that belief was perhaps their greatest advantage of all. By the late 14th century, something subtle but dangerous had begun to shift beneath the surface of Mongol control. The Golden Horde, once a unified extension of Genghis Khan's legacy, was no longer the unstoppable force it had been. Internal, rival claimants, and political instability had weakened its grip. For decades, power struggles within the Horde created cracks in what had once seemed like an unbreakable system. Most rulers saw this chaos as something to survive. One man saw it as an opportunity. His name was Dmitry Ivanovich, the young prince of Moscow, later known as Dmitry Donskoy. He wasn't born into power with the intent to challenge an empire. In fact, he inherited leadership as a child, growing up in a world where submission to the Mongols wasn't just expected, it was the norm. But Dmitry came of age at a time when the rules were quietly changing. He watched as Moscow grew stronger, more influential, more capable of leading rather than following. What made Dmitry different wasn't just ambition, it was vision. He understood something that many of his predecessors either couldn't see or were too afraid to act on. As long as the Russian principalities remained divided, they would always be controlled. Unity wasn't just a political advantage, it was the only path to survival. And so, he began doing what no Russian leader had successfully accomplished in over a century. He brought the principalities together. Through alliances, diplomacy, and at times force, Dmitry consolidated power under Moscow's leadership. Vladimir, Suzdal, Rostov, and even the powerful merchant city of Novgorod began to align behind him. This wasn't just a coalition, it was the early formation of something far more dangerous to the Mongols. A unified front. For the Golden Horde, this was more than a political inconvenience. It was a direct threat to their entire system of control. And the man who recognized this most clearly was Mame, a powerful warlord who effectively controlled the western portion of the Horde. Mame wasn't a legitimate Khan by bloodline, but he held real power, and he knew exactly what was at stake. If Dmitry succeeded, if Moscow stopped paying tribute and faced no consequences, it wouldn't stop there. Other regions would follow. The carefully maintained balance of fear and obedience would collapse. Mame understood that this wasn't just about one rebellious prince. This was about preventing a domino effect that could unravel Mongol dominance entirely. At first, the response was predictable. In 1378, Mame sent a military force to discipline Dmitry, expecting a quick and decisive reminder of Mongol authority. It was supposed to be routine, a raid, a show of force, a return to order. But what happened instead sent shockwaves through both sides. Dmitry didn't retreat. He didn't negotiate. He met the Mongol force head-on at the Voza River and won. It wasn't just a battlefield victory. It was psychological. For the first time in generations, Russian forces had defeated a Mongol army in open combat. The myth of invincibility didn't shatter that day, but it cracked. And once a belief like that begins to break, it never fully recovers. For Mame, this changed everything. A small rebellion had just become a full-scale threat. There was no longer room for limited responses or symbolic punishment. If control was going to be maintained, it had to be decisive and overwhelming. So he began to prepare. Mame assembled one of the largest forces seen in decades. Mongol cavalry, seasoned and lethal as ever. Allied troops from across the steppe. Mercenaries, including heavily armored cavalry from Genoese colonies. Even political alliances were formed to isolate Dmitry and crush his growing power. This wasn't just an expedition anymore. It was a calculated effort to eliminate a rising power before it could fully emerge. And Dmitry knew it was coming. He understood the scale of what he was up against. He knew he was outnumbered, outmatched in experience, and facing a military machine that had dominated for over a century. But for the first time, he also knew something else. The Mongols could be beaten. Now, the question wasn't whether conflict would happen. It was whether he could win the one battle that would change everything. Dmitry knew he couldn't beat the Mongols by fighting their war. If he met them on open ground with room to maneuver, their cavalry would do what it had always done: outflank, outpace, and systematically dismantle his army. So instead of matching strength against strength, he made a different choice. He chose the battlefield. The location he settled on was a broad stretch of land near the meeting point of the Don and Nepriadva rivers, what would come to be known as Kulikovo Field. At first glance, it didn't look extraordinary, but strategically, it was almost perfect. Forests bordered the sides, and the rivers lay behind the Russian position. This wasn't just geography, it was control. The Mongols would be forced into a frontal engagement, stripped of their greatest advantage, mobility. No sweeping flanking maneuvers, no easy retreats to reset the fight. If they committed, they would be locked in. Then Dmitry made a decision that revealed just how far he was willing to go. He ordered his entire army to cross the Don River, placing it behind them. It was a bold move, some would say reckless. In practical terms, it eliminated any possibility of retreat. But psychologically, it did something far more powerful. It turned the battle into a point of no return. Every soldier understood the message without it being spoken. There was no going back. They would either win here, or they would die here. The army Dmitry assembled reflected both desperation and determination. It wasn't a single, unified force in the modern sense, but a coalition drawn from multiple principalities: Moscow, Vladimir, Suzdal, Rostov, and others. There were elite cavalry units, heavily armored and trained for direct combat, alongside infantry levies made up of ordinary men, farmers, craftsmen, townspeople, who had taken up arms because there was no alternative left. They were not as experienced or as refined as the Mongol warriors they would face, but they carried something just as important: a shared purpose. Morale mattered, and Dmitry understood that. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was framed as something larger: a fight for independence, for identity, for the right to exist without submission. Religious leaders accompanied the army, offering blessings and reinforcing the belief that their cause was just. In a world where fear had long dictated outcomes, belief became a counterweight. But belief alone wouldn't win the battle. Dmitry needed something more, something unexpected. Hidden within the forests along the Russian flank was the element that would define everything: a carefully positioned ambush force. This wasn't a small scouting unit or a loose group of reserves. It was a disciplined formation of heavy cavalry, hand-picked and specifically prepared for one purpose: to strike at exactly the right moment. They were placed out of sight, shielded by terrain, and given strict orders to remain concealed no matter what unfolded on the main battlefield. Even as the fighting intensified, even as their own side would begin to struggle, they were to wait. Timing wasn't just important, it was everything. Too early, and the Mongols would still have the strength to counter. Too late, and there would be nothing left to save. This was the real gamble. The plan required not just strategy, but trust. Trust that the main force could hold long enough, trust that the commanders could read the battle in real time, and trust that when the moment came, the ambush would hit with enough force to change the outcome. It's easy to think of a secret weapon as something physical, some new technology or tool. But what Dmitry was building here wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a sequence, a setup, a carefully engineered moment where every variable, terrain, timing, positioning, and psychology would align. If it worked, it wouldn't just win the battle. It would break a system that had held for over a century. Morning came slowly over Kulikovo Field, the fog lifting just enough to reveal two massive armies facing each other in tense silence. For a moment, nothing moved. No arrows flew, no cavalry charged. Then, as if following an ancient script, a single rider emerged from the Russian lines. He wasn't dressed like a noble or a general. He wore the robes of a monk. His name was Alexander Peresvet. From the Mongol side, a champion rode forward to meet him, a seasoned warrior known for his size, strength, and reputation across the Pei. This wasn't just a duel. It was symbolism. Two worlds colliding before the battle even began. Faith against dominance. Defiance against inevitability. They lowered their lances and charged. The impact was violent and immediate. Both men struck true. The Mongol champion was thrown from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. Peresvet, mortally wounded, somehow remained in the saddle for a few moments longer before collapsing. dead but still upright. To the Russian army, that image meant everything. It wasn't just a victory. It was a sign. And then the illusion of stillness shattered. The Mongol drums began to beat, low and relentless, like a heartbeat accelerating toward chaos. Waves of cavalry surged forward, beginning with mounted archers who moved with terrifying precision. Arrows filled the sky, cutting through the air in thick, deadly arcs. The Russians had seen this before, or at least they had heard of it. Entire armies had broken under this exact pressure. The instinct was to charge, to break formation, to escape the rain of death. But this time they held. Shields raised, formations tight, they absorbed the storm. It wasn't clean. Men fell. Horses screamed. But the line didn't collapse. Dmitri's forces had been prepared for this moment. They knew the Mongols wanted panic. They refused to give it to them. When the arrows failed to break the line, the Mongols escalated. Heavy cavalry moved in, backed by coordinated waves of riders pressing from multiple angles. The battlefield transformed instantly, from distant pressure to brutal, close-quarters violence. Steel clashed against steel. The ground churned into mud beneath thousands of pounding hooves. Visibility dropped as dust and smoke mixed with the morning fog. Command and control began to blur. At the center of it all, the Russian line began to bend. This was the phase where Mongol armies usually won. Sustained pressure, constant movement, relentless fatigue. Eventually, something would give. And it started to happen. The Russian center, anchored by Dmitri himself, was being pushed back. Units lost cohesion. Gaps began to appear. On the flanks, Mongol cavalry probed aggressively, searching for openings to encircle and collapse the entire formation. For hours, the Russians fought on the edge of breaking. Dmitri was in the thick of it, not observing from a distance but fighting among his men. At some point during the chaos, he was wounded. His armor, once a symbol of command, made him a target. It said he had to exchange it with another soldier just to survive. That soldier didn't make it. For a time, rumors spread that Dmitri himself had fallen. And still, the line held, barely. From the Mongol perspective, victory was within reach. The system was working. The enemy was weakening. Just a little more pressure, a few more coordinated pushes, and the entire Russian force would collapse into retreat, or worse, into chaos. But there was one thing they didn't see. Hidden beyond the edge of the battlefield, concealed by forest and patience, the ambush force waited. Thousands of heavy cavalry, fresh, disciplined, and silent. They had heard the battle raging for hours. They had listened as their own side struggled, as the sounds of combat grew more desperate. Every instinct would have told them to move, to reinforce, to react. But they didn't. They waited, because timing was everything. Then, finally, the moment came. The Mongol forces had fully committed. Their formations, once precise and controlled, were stretched thin from continuous engagement. Horses were tiring. Units were focused forward, locked into the fight. On one flank, the pressure had gone too far. Momentum without structure, aggression without awareness. That's when the signal was given. Out of the forest, like a force of nature breaking loose, the ambush erupted. Thousands of armored cavalry surged forward in tight formation, accelerating into a full charge. This wasn't a skirmish. This was impact warfare at its most brutal. Lances leveled, momentum building, they crashed directly into the exposed flank of the Mongol cavalry. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Mongols, masters of mobility and distance fighting, were suddenly caught in the worst possible scenario: close-range, high-impact collision with a heavier force they hadn't anticipated. There was no time to reposition, no space to maneuver. Formations shattered on contact. Riders were thrown from their horses. Lines that had held for hours disintegrated in minutes. And the attack didn't stop there. The ambush force pushed through the flank and into the rear, tearing through command positions, supply lines, and any remaining structure. Confusion spread rapidly. Orders couldn't be heard. Signals were lost. Units began to act independently, and that's when discipline breaks. What had been a controlled offensive turned into something else entirely. Panic. The psychological edge that had defined Mongol warfare for generations flipped in an instant. Now they were the ones being struck from unexpected angles. Now they were the ones losing control. And once that shift happens in battle, it's almost impossible to reverse. The Russian center, which had been on the verge of collapse, felt the pressure lift. Reinforcements moved forward. The line stabilized, then pushed. What had been a defensive struggle became an offensive surge. The Mongol army began to unravel. What started as a tactical withdrawal quickly turned into a full retreat. Units broke formation, riders fleeing in different directions, each trying to escape the collapse. Coordination disappeared. The system that had made them nearly unstoppable, the discipline, the structure, the timing, was gone. By the time the sun began to fall, the battlefield told a different story. Where once stood the most feared cavalry force in the world, there was now chaos, retreat, and defeat. Kulikovo wasn't just a battle that was won. It was a moment where the impossible became real. When the noise of battle finally faded, Kulikovo field was left in silence, broken only by the wind moving across a landscape covered in the cost of victory. Thousands of men lay where they had fallen, on both sides. For the Russians, this was not a clean triumph. It was hard-earned, deeply painful, and incomplete. The Mongol threat did not disappear overnight. Tribute would still be demanded. Raids would still come. But something far more important had changed. For the first time in generations, the idea of Mongol invincibility was gone. That shift mattered more than any single battlefield outcome. Because once people see that power can be challenged, everything begins to move. Over the next century, that belief would grow into action, and eventually into independence. Kulikovo wasn't the end of Mongol dominance, but it was the beginning of its decline. A single victory didn't break an empire, but it proved that breaking it was possible. And that brings us back to the question at the heart of this story: what was the real, secret weapon? It wasn't just the ambush. It wasn't the cavalry. It wasn't even the battlefield. It was the mindset behind it all. The willingness to study a stronger opponent instead of fearing them. The discipline to wait for the right moment instead of reacting emotionally. The courage to commit fully, knowing there was no easy way out. Strategy, timing, and belief working together. That's how empires begin to fall. Not just from external pressure, but from the moment someone decides they're no longer unbeatable. If you enjoy stories that go beyond history, stories about strategy, leadership, and the moments that change everything, make sure to subscribe and follow the channel. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons don't come from winning easily, they come from winning when no one thinks you can.